Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into reports about a potential decline in travel, looking at both international visitors coming to the United States and, maybe surprisingly, travel happening within the U.S. itself.
Yeah, it's a really interesting intersection, isn't it? Because travel, I mean, it's this massive global industry, but it also touches on these broader sort of international perceptions and even how people behave closer to home.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a stack of sources trying to get different angles. We've got insights from a YouTube transcript discussing U.S. travel boycotts, some specific data points from the National Travel and Tourism Office.
Right, and reports from Trivago that came via The Guardian, plus data from Hotel Hub via Politico, and then some, well, pretty fascinating findings from Pew Research.
So our mission here is basically to dig into all this material, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and the key data points. We want to understand what's reportedly happening in the U.S. travel sector, according to these sources anyway.
And we'll also look at the reasons and the implications that the sources themselves suggest are driving these trends. It's not just numbers, it's the why behind them, supposedly.
Yeah, and you'll find there's some surprising details in here, from anecdotal experiences right at the border to
Mhm.
specific data dips,
Hmm.
the impact on different types of travel, and even some connections the sources draw between travel habits and like wider global perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
So let's jump right into what these sources are reporting first.
Okay. Well, it's kind of striking how some of the anecdotal reports mentioned seem to line up or at least echo the data we'll get to later. For instance, one source, that YouTube transcript you mentioned, it shared an experience from a Canadian couple. They were driving through the Buffalo-Niagara Falls border crossing.
Right, and their report was that they just breezed through it. That's the quote used.
Okay.
They specifically noted there weren't nearly as many cars there as they're used to seeing.
Yeah, quieter than expected. And apparently, accompanying that anecdote was this sentiment they reportedly heard back home. The quote was something like, talk around their parts was that Canadians just don't want to come here and they don't want to spend their money here anymore.
Interesting. And that same source claimed that Canadians used to vacation here often, right?
Right.
Pointing specifically to trips down to the American South to escape winter,
Yeah, classic snowbird stuff.
and also quick getaways to parts of the northern U.S., maybe closer border states.
And connecting this specific sort of story to a broader impact, the source highlights that some portions of the country it names, especially New England, are reportedly, bracing for a drop in tourism revenue, specifically from Canadians.
And the material even included a reference, didn't it, to a reported call from someone in Canada urging Canadians to, quote, avoid travel to the United States if at all possible.
Mm-hmm. And citing concerns about citizens being denied their rights by arbitrary detention. That's pretty strong language presented in the source.
It really is. So the question becomes, are these just isolated stories, feelings, or do the sources actually present data that backs this picture up?
Well, the materials suggest there is data. It's not just anecdotes.
Okay, let's look at those numbers then, the ones these sources highlight, because this is where you start to see some clear trends being reported. Data from the National Travel and Tourism Office, mentioned in one source, apparently shows that overseas to U.S. travel declined. What was it, 11.6% in March compared to the previous year?
But 11.6% drop. Yeah, that's a noticeable dip. And then you have reports specifically focused on like hotel bookings, data from Trivago. The hotel travel site, as reported in The Guardian, indicates the U.S. is apparently seeing fewer bookings than usual from several key international markets.
Which ones did they mention?
Canada, Japan, Mexico, and Germany. Pretty significant source countries for U.S. tourism.
Okay, and drilling down into that Trivago data from The Guardian, it reportedly shows double-digit percentage declines in bookings from Japan, Canada, and Mexico.
Double digits, yeah. And the sources we looked at, they specifically point out that Canada and Mexico were the first on Trump's tariff hit list when he announced tariffs of 25%. So they're drawing that connection.
Making that link explicit. What about Germany?
Demand from Germany was also reportedly down, but it showed a single-digit percentage decline in U.S. hotel bookings. Still down, just not as steeply. And the material adds some context there, noting Germany is, the largest economy in the EU,
Right.
which the source says Trump has repeatedly threatened with increased tariffs, including apparently a paused 50% tax threat at some point.
Wow. It's interesting that the sources mention this term reportedly being used by businesses that depend on tourism. the Trump slump.
Yeah, described as pretty much exactly what it sounds like, this anticipation or perhaps reality of a decline linked to the administration.
So it sounds like a real concern reported among tourism businesses.
And according to the sources, this reported slump isn't limited just to fewer international visitors coming in. Travelers within the United States are also apparently changing their habits and spending less.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about people not coming here from abroad. These sources suggest it's also impacting how Americans themselves are reportedly traveling domestically.
Exactly. Yeah, the material reports there's like more demand for cheaper hotels. Travelers are reportedly more willing to stay at lower start hotels just to pay less overall for their trips inside the U.S.
Cutting back, maybe?
Seems like it, based on these reports.
Now, while the focus is on the U.S., the sources also provide a bit of a counterpoint, don't they? Looking at how uncertainty might be impacting travel elsewhere.
They do, yeah. They touch on the situation in the UK. Apparently, travelers there are reportedly choosing to vacation domestically more often.
And the reason given?
Uh, Concern and uncertainty over leaving the country. So, similar themes of uncertainty, but playing out differently, perhaps.
Is there data for that UK trend?
Yes, there's data presented to support that. Booking data from the UK, highlighted in the sources, reportedly shows a pretty big jump, a 25% year-over-year increase in demand for domestic summer travel.
25%, wow.
Yeah, and specific cities are seeing boosts too. London and Edinburgh apparently near a 30% increase, and places like York, Blackpool, and Manchester also seeing more domestic tourists, according to the reports.
And the reported explanation for this from Trivago's chief executive Johannes Thomas, it was quoted in one source, wasn't it?
Yeah, quite straightforward. In times of uncertainty, people stay closer to home. Makes intuitive sense, I suppose.
It does. This really raises an important question maybe about how these global and political climates can influence travel decisions, not just across borders, but even, domestically in other countries that might be feeling some uncertainty.
Absolutely. And it seems business travel isn't immune either, according to these sources.
Ah, right. There was data from Politico citing a London-based company called Hotel Hub.
That's the one, yeah. They specialize in business travel bookings. And their data reportedly found that bookings in April were down significantly.
That was significant.
By 26% from a year ago. That's a big drop for business travel.
Over a quarter decline year on year. And the reason given by Hotel Hub's chief commercial officer?
Well, he's quoted as saying there's been a lot of uncertainty around the traditional partnership with the U.S. since the new administration took office, and even more so since the tariff announcements. That's the direct quote presented. So according to this source, businesses are reportedly looking elsewhere, seeking alternative markets to offer greater stability.
Okay. So pulling all these reported trends together now, the anecdotes, the booking data, business travel, what's the broader context? What are the wider implications that the sources discuss?
Well, the sources definitely try to connect these travel trends to discussions about the overall U.S. reputation on the global stage. They state pretty plainly that the U.S. is reportedly seeing a marked deterioration in its reputation.
And what are the contributing factors discussed in the sources? What do they point to?
A few things are mentioned. Claims about Trump reportedly unleashing a global trade war, attacking traditional U.S. allies, and then also social media apparently being filled with stories of travelers being mistreated while trying to enter the country. So policy and perception playing roles, according to these reports.
The sources also bring up the U.S. national debt and credit rating, don't they? How does that fit in?
Yeah, they note the national credit rating has reportedly been downgraded, and they link that partly to growing debt. One source puts it around $36 trillion, and also the U.S. government's perceived inability to manage that debt.
So financial stability concerns mixed in with the trade and political stuff.
Exactly. And the interpretation offered in the sources, particularly regarding the international business reputation, it's quite direct. It says international agencies are reportedly calling out the leadership as, quote, incompetent or even malicious. Strong words again.
Very strong. And ultimately, the reported outcome presented across these different sources seems to be that this decline in international travel, whether it's for business or pleasure, it's viewed by them as a, quote, sad state of affairs.
That phrase definitely captures the overall tone of concern in the materials.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit now because there's another whole dimension these sources touch on. And that's reports on American travel habits themselves, and maybe even worldviews, citing findings from Pew Research.
Right. This is where it pivots to look inward, so to speak.
The material claims Americans are, quote, notorious for not traveling much outside of our own borders. Is that fair?
Well, that's the claim made. It's noted that it's reportedly not unusual to find Americans who've never even left their own state, let alone the country, and that many don't have passports. There's an estimate cited in the sources that only maybe 45–50% of Americans have one.
Less than half,
Hmm.
potentially. And the sources mentioned this reported bad reputation for being ignorant of other nations and cultures,
Yeah.
and suggest this is reportedly related, somehow, to these low international travel rates.
Now, of course, the material does acknowledge the geographic reality. It points out it's much easier and cheaper for Europeans to visit another country than it is for Americans, just given the distances involved for many.
That's a fair point. There's also a mention, kind of critical, about Americans reportedly staying at American-run resorts when they do go abroad.
Yes, and the source's opinion on that is pretty clear, that this hardly counts as immersing oneself in another culture. Bit of a judgment there.
Right. But here's where those findings from Pew Research, as cited in the source, become particularly, well, insightful, I thought.
Yeah, this was interesting.
2023 polling reportedly found that Americans who have traveled widely abroad, and they define that as visiting 5 or more countries,
Okay.
these people reportedly have greater interests in foreign affairs, and they also tend to prioritize U.S. engagement in world affairs, including valuing compromise with other nations.
So, a direct link being drawn in the Pew data, as reported, between traveling more and having a more sort of globally engaged perspective.
Exactly. That's a fascinating connection the source is highlighting based on that Pew data. And the source's interpretation of this is that people who travel internationally tend to be less individualistic than those who don't, describing this outlook as less America first.
Framing it in those terms. Less individualistic, less America first.
Mm-hmm.
And then, based on these findings and tying it back to that reported decline in American international travel we discussed earlier, the source kind of speculates, doesn't it? Maybe the administration might not be entirely mad their word about Americans traveling less internationally.
Even despite the potential economic impact on these huge trillion-dollar industries like tourism and aviation.
That's the speculation presented, yeah. Linking the reported Pew findings about worldviews to the travel trends. It's quite a thought.
It really is. Okay, so let's just quickly recap our deep dive into these sources then. We've seen these reports of declining international travel to the U.S. and also changes in domestic travel within the U.S.
You're right, backed up by specific data points mentioned from the National Travel and Tourism Office, from Trivago, and from Hotel Hub focusing on business travel.
And the sources explicitly link these reported trends to factors like tariffs and the broader political climate. They discuss the impact on tourism revenue and business decisions.
We also looked at that counterpoint reported increases in domestic travel elsewhere, like the significant jump seen in the UK, linked again to uncertainty.
And finally, we touched on that really interesting connection drawn from the Pew Research data, as presented in these sources, between international travel habits and potentially broader worldviews and attitudes towards global engagement.
Yeah, the materials definitely suggest that these reported trends, if they hold true, have significant implications that extend far beyond just the economic numbers involved in travel and tourism.
Absolutely. It touches on reputation, international relations, maybe even domestic perspectives. Which leads to maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to consider drawing from all this material. If, as that Pew data presented in these sources suggests, international travel is linked to having a greater interest in foreign affairs and maybe valuing compromise with other nations more, what might be the long-term impact on perspectives, both here and maybe abroad, and on global engagement if fewer people generally are traveling across borders?
Yeah, what happens if that cross-cultural exposure decreases? It's definitely something to mull over based on what these sources highlight.